Hello everybody and welcome to another video, and today it is the 7th of October, and today was relatively uneventful, but I will go over the events that did occur. And so we will start off with Kherson, where specifically around Kiselivka, the 63rd Brigade of the AFU is preparing for an assault in the direction of Maximivka. So we're gonna have to see how that turns out. Maximivka, minor town, and you just have this chain of towns over here that's centered around a minor river. And so there is a possibility for a breakthrough over here. These three towns over here, these four towns, they're part of a large grouping of AFU brigades, and they're centered around here. They are being used to fight around the Nova Petrivka, Blahodatne, and Partizanske. There was actually a chance that Russia would be able to break through over here a few months ago when they took Blahodatne, and there was actually a chance that they would assault Provomaiske itself. But for now, the situation over here is relatively stable. Let's move on to the defensive line around Milove. So over here, the Ukrainian gains are still being consolidated. So you now have units like the 128th Mountain Assault Brigade just consolidating their gains, entering these towns like Trifonivka. I know that they're now present in this town, but I'm not sure about the status of Piatikati. It might still be in the gray zone, but eventually they will make it into this town. You also have the 60th Infantry Brigade and the 17th Tank Brigade. So all of them are working in tandem, and they do plan to launch assaults towards the new Russian line, which is around Milove and Borozenske. So they're going to be launching probing attacks in the coming days with their DRG platoons. So that is something to look out for. But in the meantime, both sides are just consolidating their gains, and there are some artillery duels, of course. Specifically, the 60th Infantry Brigade, they have set up some new artillery positions around Petropavlivka, one of these towns that was recently taken back by Ukraine. And so they are beginning to shell the new defensive line made by the Russians. So there was a bit of ambiguity as to the situation around Duchini, because um, there were different reports going in from the pro-Russia side about the southern part of the town still being under Russian control. So I'm gonna talk about this town for a second. So when the Ukrainians broke through and actually reached this area, the 126th Coastal Defense Brigade was in this area. They're the Russian unit that was told to hold the line, and there were also some VDV troops that were stationed along the northern line. But the 126th Coastal Defense Brigade, it is one of the main units, about 2,000 people, and so they were sort of a formidable force. They actually fought in Voznesensk. That was a pretty difficult battle, but they ended up getting pushed back from there. So they were tasked with holding the line as the Ukrainians advanced. And so there were some reports coming in over the past few days from the Western media. There was actually a Forbes article about this, about how the entire brigade was decimated and that they suffered some very heavy losses over here, and that basically the entire unit is dissolved. The remnants, they would be integrated into the 76th Air Assault Brigade. And so I can't really confirm the validity of this, but it seems as if there was some very heavy fighting around Duchini. And according to Military Maps, which is a pro-Russia map, which is pretty connected to a lot of the Russian media, so they have a good understanding of what's going on in there. They're actually saying that the southern part of Duchini is still contested, and that the 126th Brigade is still actually operating in there, and that National Guard troops were sent in to hold the line. I'm not exactly sure if that's true. They did say that the bridge was blown up as well, and so, if that's the case, then it does show that they're trying to just hold the Ukrainians back for as long as possible before they actually have to withdraw to Milove. But for now, I'm still keeping it as under Ukrainian control until I actually find evidence for this claim. But really, besides that, there's not much in the Kherson region. In the Zaporizhzhia region, again, not much, but I do have to talk about one thing. There was a DRG operation in this area with a platoon of some troops, probably recon, and they were Ukrainian troops, but there were also some foreign troops. They might be from the Foreign Legion, or they might be working with Azov, because I know Azov is situated around the Zaporizhzhia area right now, and they do have some like programs with like foreign volunteers and stuff. So I saw patches with like British flags and American flags, German flags, French flags. There was even a German flag that I saw, and so they were fighting in the area just to the north of Polohi. You do have some just like fields over here and forested areas. So they did launch some sort of recon operation, which is becoming more and more of a thing. It's more commonplace on this part of the front line as of the past month or so. And so they were fighting in this area, and they got spotted by the Russian forces and repelled. So there's some GoPro footage of that, which is pretty interesting and also pretty graphic. But it does indicate, first of all, that Ukraine is trying to probe into the Russian lines to see what sort of defensive fortifications they have built, or what sort of manpower they have, what sort of defensive capabilities, and also that there's actually a lot of NATO support in this area specifically, because I know that, for instance, the British, they've been training a lot of the Ukrainian troops that are operating in Zaporizhzhia. You also have the 44th Artillery Brigade. They've been just getting replenished recently, and so they're starting to strike a lot of like positions along the front line. You also have a lot of German training and some units, some soldiers that are actually from German units. They have their patches on them, and I saw that was also visible. And so you are seeing a lot of these NATO trained forces operating in the Zaporizhzhia area. In terms of numbers, I did see like 12,000. It could be even higher than that. And so there is the possibility that they attempt to break through. And if they were to break through, then Polohi would be a main objective of theirs, because, look, it is pretty close to the front line, and it is a rather large city, and it is a key supply hub. And so if Ukraine were ever to launch an offensive in this area, they would have to take this town. But let's move on now to the Donetsk front right now, where I do have some minor changes I made to the map around Marinka based on new footage. So, first of all, I know that I said the line of fighting for a while was around Drewsby Street over here. It might have been, but just due to like a month of Ukrainian counterattacks, it does seem that they were pushed back to around this line that I'm going over in red right now. And it does make sense because it's just like positional fighting at this point. No side has really committed that much resources to this area. The fighting here was much more intense during the summer, and so now it's just like every few days or so you have a Ukrainian counterattack, and then the DPR forces, they try to regain their positions. But I do know that this farm area is still under the DPR control. That's one of their strongholds. And then, of course, they gained some ground over here. We have a video of them advancing around Marinka, but this is pretty deep into the lines that I had drawn previously. They took over this trench line over here. Literally every single hedgerow is filled with trenches, so it is very difficult to advance over here. Getting out of the trenches is like, it could prove fatal, just given the high amount of artillery and drones in this area. And so they have to be very cautious when advancing, especially given the fact that they have limited men and ammo. Both sides I'm talking about in this regard. But specifically the DPR forces, they are advancing in the direction of this road over here, which is now under their control. And this is the final road before they reach Pub Jada. And the DPR unit doing this is the 11th Regiment. And they've been trying to reach Pub Jada for a while now. It is a pretty heavily fortified area, but it is still nonetheless a small town. You can see this is the one area that is pretty fortified. You have some houses just to the east of the town itself, and the town itself is on this road over here, which is a very important road. I did have some videos on it that I made over the summer where I talked about the significance of this road. And actually reaching this road, it would actually cut off a lot of the supplies to the garrison in Novomikhailivka. A lot of Ukrainians are stationed in there, and then also it could help them help the Russians reach Kostiantynivka, and then actually help them break through around Pavlivka. But again, the advances around here are so slow that this would take a while to actually manifest. Now let's move on to the battles in Provomaiske. So there's another Provomaiske, which is just to the north of Peski. And I did talk about, I think it was yesterday, that the Russians broke through over here and the new line of fighting was just around this reservoir. But we now have footage for the first time of this town, and it does prove that it is contested. So this is now confirmed. There is fighting in Provomaiske. We have actually some footage, first of all, of Russian artillery barrages, and they're usually the units that launch the artillery. The Russian regulars do the artillery, and then the DPR, they actually go on the ground and take over the front lines, the Ukrainian defensive positions. And so we have some drone footage of that, which does prove, based on the geolocation, that they are at least in the southern part of the town. But by now, it seems as if they've sort of advanced along this entire area. All the houses are damaged, at least partially. A lot of them are leveled. And you have house-house combat based on the drone footage with like Ukrainians and Russians going back and forth. And it is pretty crazy. It does look a lot like the sort of um, urban warfare that we've seen throughout history. Something that I did notice from the drone video is that this bridge over here, which is supposed to like connect the ring road from the north to the south, that bridge is actually still standing. So no side actually chose to strike it, or the engineering must be that good that it hasn't collapsed yet. But I thought after like a months of fighting in this area that it would have collapsed already, but I guess not. Anyway, the fighting here is not that substantial. The gains are pretty minimal. I would say it's like a few hundred meters gained, but once Pervomaiske were to fall, then that will be a very interesting conversation that I have to have about what would happen next in terms of like Netselove Vodiane. So look out for what happens here nonetheless. But let's move on to Bakhmut, where we do have some minor news to report on. Zaitsev, by now, it might actually be fully under Russian control. I was just being cautious by marking it as contested, but it could actually be under their full control because the Ukrainians have withdrawn from the area. Not sure if the Russians are in this northwestern part of the town just yet, but we do have videos from the southern part of the town over here that was geolocated. I would have done it myself, but luckily some other person did it for me. So here we have some Ukrainian artillery strikes on the Russian positions as they just entered the first buildings in southern Zaitsev. And then we have here another video just from like central Zaitsev, which shows Ukrainian artillery strikes, which does prove that Russians are in this area. We do also have a media report from Zaitsev, and usually the media comes in like a few days after the initial advances. So this could also prove that the fighting isn't that close to where the video was recorded. This is not the exact location, it's just based on the fact that they were just entering the town, so I put it over here. Um, but yeah, the Ukrainians are withdrawing, probably using this road over here that I talked about to reach Opitny and Ivanhrad. But Ivanhrad, even that town's being threatened right now. Once the Russians get full control over Zaitsev, then the Wagner group, they can launch a two-pronged attack on the southern suburbs like this. They would take the road connecting Zaitsev to the Bakhmut road and reach Opitny, and then from Veseldolina they can reach Ivanhrad. And so that's something that could potentially happen once Wagner consolidates its new gains over here. We also heard about some reports of fighting that reaches Andriivka. Andriivka is a very small town which is very close to the front lines at this point, and it is possible that the Russians will go for this because it would give them a good advantage in terms of flanking Kurdyumivka. It would not have to be attacked head on. They can sort of attack from several sides at once, and it would also give them a stronghold just to the south of Klishchivka, which is another important town that needs to be captured in order to cut off Bakhmut. So that is all important, but let's move on now to the Kreminna front, where really I don't have much to say, just that the 128th Territorial Defense Battalion has been recorded in Makivka, and so we have the footage over here which does confirm that Makivka is finally under Ukrainian control. This was an important town in terms of it being a coordination hub for the Russians a few weeks ago, and it is situated around the Zherebets River, so now they can cross it in this area and approach Ploshchanka, and they could also advance further north in the direction of some of these other towns over here, and most importantly Sabotage, where there have been recordings of reinforcements being sent in. In terms of where they're being sent in from, that is an interesting question. I'm not exactly sure from where they're being sent in. They might be some reservists that were just like mobilized recently, or they might be moved in from other fronts like the Donetsk front, or maybe they were just like sent in from Kherson right before the front line collapsed over there. But either way, you do have a lot of Kamaz trucks with troops in them and equipment, and so it seems as if the Russians are digging in around Svatove. But on the flip side, they are withdrawing from the Oskil line, which is something that I have to report on right now. This map, I don't know what happened to the map over here. I'm going to pause the video for a second and fix that. So all these towns along the Oskil River, they were originally used as a defensive line by Russia, but once the Ukrainians actually crossed through Kupiansk and through Duchini and then advanced from the south towards Borova, it sort of proved that this line was not effective, and they saw the writing on the wall, the Russians, and they just began their retreat. And so now you actually have a connection between the Ukrainian grouping, which advanced to the north from Yatskivka, Rubitsy, and eventually reached Borova, and then the 92nd Brigade, which fought around Kupiansk, and also the Kraken Battalion. They were photoed over here in Polohi. We already knew this was under their control, but now it's just confirmed. And so they're pushing in the direction of Kislivka. Every day they're getting closer, but still the Russians are situated in Kislivka, so they intend to hold out over there because it could be a way to buy time for the new defensive line, which will be around the Krasna River. But another thing that I find interesting is that while the Russians have withdrawn from all these like different towns around the Oskil River that I'm clicking on right now, they have now withdrawn from the towns just to the north of it that are also on the Oskil River. So I'm talking about like Liman Druhi and like Tavilzhanka, for instance, or even Liman Pershi. These towns, the Russians are still have a presence in them. And so we're going to have to see for how long this is. It seems as if it's a way to, first of all, buy time because they don't want Ukraine advancing along the Russian border. And if they do actually advance over here, then they can actually reach Troitske. And I know I've talked about it before, but it is a key supply hub for Svatove and also for Starobilsk. And so the Russians want to keep the front line away from this city for as long as possible, which is why you also have not seen really much of a Ukrainian advance in this bridgehead around Tablozhanka. But now that the Ukrainian groupings around Kupiansk have really just solidified their gains and have linked up with some other Ukrainian units from elsewhere, it does seem as if the Ukrainians could probably like make a push in the direction of Liman Pershi and take that over pretty easily. But then from there, it's going to be difficult to take over Vilshana if the Russians give some resistance. You might see a new line forming like this, and then the Ukrainians' goal would obviously be to reach Novo Jehorivka, this town over here, and then actually reach the Starobilsk, not Starobilsk, Svatove Road. But that's really in terms of the front line. There are a few other things I want to talk about before I end the video. And so, first of all, over here in this airfield, which is pretty deep into Russian territory, about 200 kilometers in, this airfield is called Shaikovka Air Base. And there was a report a few hours ago that there was actually a drone attack. There was not any footage I saw of it. It was just reported by a Russian channel. But they say that it was a kamikaze drone that was operating very close to the airfield. So that would imply that Ukrainian saboteurs actually entered the Russian border in order to launch the drone and attack the different military targets in this area. So there are two 22 bombers stationed in this area, and there are about 20 of them. And so this is a pretty interesting target. It is very far away from the front lines, though, so it is interesting. But really, there was no damage done and no casualties, at least by those Russian channels. That's what they said, and I did not see any footage of it, so I don't really know what happened over there. But it does show that Ukraine does still have the capability to go behind the front lines and actually commit these acts of sabotage. I know over the summer, that's really when they did this the most. Around August, you had like a lot of those strikes in like the Belgorod area and also in Crimea. So seems as if they can still do that even now. Last thing is that Elon Musk's Starlink has actually experienced some issues around the front line, and so there's a lot of ambiguity and questions as to what caused this. And so there were about like three theories that I read about that could explain why Starlink is down in a lot of these areas. And Starlink is used as like a free connection server for a lot of these Ukrainian troops that are operating near the front line, and it does help with a lot of the coordination. And so this is a big problem for them now that it's having some issues. So the first theory is that, you know, if you were on Twitter, you would have seen this. Elon Musk, he was in a lot of drama because he was like lining out his peace proposal for the Russia-Ukraine war, and it angered a lot of Ukraine supporters. And so there's a feeling that he may have backtracked on his support for Ukraine, and that now he's actually going to stop with the Starlink program. So that's possible. It's also possible that the Russians have actually developed some technology to disrupt Ukraine's satellite systems. Just this week, the Russian military actually started testing this Terrata 2S satellite jammer, and so that might have been a part of why Starlink was not able to operate. Then the other thing that could have caused this is that the Ukrainian advances in both Kherson and Kharkiv were so large scale that the new front lines don't actually have any Starlink connection, because Starlink doesn't apply to any of the Russian controlled areas, and so they now need to set it up in those new areas. And so either way, it is an issue that has to be resolved for the Ukrainians. But again, that's really it for today. It was more of a quiet day, but I do expect the situation to heat up in the upcoming days and weeks. So keep your eyes out for that. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you later.